Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. Today, I am grateful to be joined by Dr. Alice Penn. This is not her first time on the show. We actually have a first recording that we can link up in the show notes for you guys if you want to listen to her first appearance on the Sync Your Life podcast, where we really dove into her story and helping women find purpose. I got a lot of really great feedback from that episode. A lot of people shared that out on their social media. I heard a lot of great stuff. So I wanted to invite her back, and I wanted to dive deeper into her knowledge, not just in how we find purpose, but how we also sort of bridge the gap between women and stress, and also kind of becoming who we are intended to be, living into our fullest potential. So this is totally her wheelhouse. She has a medical doctor background, a finance background, but she's now helping women and people in general just find their purpose and find what they're meant to do in life. And so Dr. Alice Penn, please introduce yourself to my audience again, in case they didn't listen to the first episode. Share your story. Tell us how you got to doing what you do now.
So, hi, Jenny. Thanks so much for having me back. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, for those who haven't heard the first episode, I am actually joining you today from Cape Town, South Africa, where I was born. And I was the eldest child in my family, kind of quite a typical family with a father who's a medical doctor. My mother actually was a nurse and has numerous degrees, but was a homemaker. And yeah, I did well at school and did all the sports and all the cultural activities. And I never really knew what I wanted to do. But when I got towards the end of school and everyone was applying for college and university, I thought, you know what, I'm going to do medicine. My dad's a doctor. A lot of the people we know are doctors. And I think because I had no real clear vision or identity of who I was, I just thought this is something that I think good people do. So I think it was kind of that allure that if I'm doing this, I'll be helping people and it'll be a good thing for me to be doing. And the children who were doing well at school, a lot of them were going into medicine. So I went ahead, I started, I think I was 17 on my first day. And pretty quickly, I thought, I'm not so sure if this is right for me. But I did what a lot of people would have done, and I just persevered. And I went through all of the training and then went into my internship and a year that we call community service here in South Africa in the rural hospitals. And the whole way through, I kept thinking, I just don't know if this is for me. But at that stage, I kept thinking it's probably more my fault. I'm probably not having the right attitude or approach. Maybe I just need to keep trying harder and things will get better in time. After a few years of working here in South Africa, I did what a lot of South Africans do, and I went and I moved to the UK. I moved to London. And again, the sort of voices were coming to me saying, maybe there's something else you could be doing. But in the end, I actually I joined a private practice in London. And I thought it was the best of both worlds because it was a private medical practice, but right in the middle of the financial district. So many of my clients were corporate. We worked a lot with corporates, helping them with their well-being of their staff. And I also thought perhaps I can get involved in the business side of things because it had really always probably underneath it all, I was thinking my dream is to have my own business. Anyway, I did well in the practice, and I must say, although I am forever grateful for all the patients that I met and the privilege that I had to get to speak to them and know them and help them, I knew deep down still that I wasn't in the right place for me. And I think the combination of knowing that and feeling quite stuck, along with troubles in my personal life. So my marriage, almost failed before it even started. And I had a husband with addiction problems and all of the side effects that come from that. And I think these two aspects of my life, feeling like I'm in the wrong place for me professionally, struggling in my personal life, it just took its toll. And I began to suffer quite a lot with my mental health and actually my physical health. And I took a little bit of time away from work. And I used that time to really consider what I wanted to do with my professional life. So I made a really big pivot and moved into the world of corporate finance, which is a little bit unusual for a medical doctor, but I was working in the healthcare sector, advising healthcare clients. So my career there went well. I thrived. I loved it. I loved working with the team, with really brilliant people, but I hadn't really addressed some of my underlying troubles that I'd been having in my earlier years. And after some time, again, my marriage actually unfortunately ended after a lot of attempts to keep it going. And again, I just took this pivotal life moment to consider what I really wanted. So I actually, at that stage, packed 2 suitcases, flew back to South Africa, to be closer to my family and sort of reevaluate what I wanted. And that's when I decided, although I felt perhaps I'd failed in some way, I actually decided, this is a moment for me to do what I've always wanted to do, which is to start my own business. So I wanted to bring together my own personal story, along with my sort of medical knowledge and experience, as well as my commercial advisory experience into one. And this is what I do now. I help people try to figure out what it is that they really want in their professional lives, whether it's their career or business, where they're at their best, where they would be at their fullest potential, and then help them implement and execute that.
Yeah, and I just want to mention as an aside that I love following you on social media. I've noticed a lot of videos and live things that you're doing in your stories, and I find so much inspiration from you. We'll make sure that we link up your social media in the show notes as well.
Oh,
but
thanks, Jenny. That's great.
I just want to say that, isn't it interesting how society wants to sort of box us into something, right? Like when we go to university, or when we decide to take that next step beyond high school or whatever the case is I think of the same thing for myself, right? Like I knew what my skill sets were, but yet I had to find a box to fit them in. And I think it's pretty common. And I think it's something that now that I'm closer to 40, I can look back and say, I really wish someone would have told me that I could really use my skill sets in unique ways. I could become entrepreneurial. I could turn it into a business, or I could potentially not have to be boxed into a corporate job or a traditional job title. So it's interesting that's your story as well. I hear this often. And so of course it leads to this journey of self-discovery. It leads to this, sense of who am I? What mission am I here to serve? Like, who am I here to serve?
Mm-hmm.
And I know we talked a little bit about that last time on the podcast, but I just wanted to say that I think women listening will resonate, because I think a lot of us have been there to where we're like, what am I intended to do? Right. And then you throw potentially motherhood or other things into the mix, and you really start to question what is that purpose, and who am I here for? Before we get into that, though, I want to make sure, today's topic is stress. We talked in advance of, okay, what's something that we can really serve my listeners with? And obviously my listeners are women dominantly. And so I see this when I'm teaching hormone health. I see this sort of issue arise, especially women that are in their 30s. Maybe they're parenting, maybe they're trying to juggle many hats with a corporate job or some sort of job as well. And stress really starts to take a toll. And we know what stress can do on the body, as far as affecting our cortisol, affecting our sleep, and then of course that impacting our hormone health. I talk about that on a lot of previous episodes. But I want to talk to you about stress, because obviously you have a background in medicine, but you are also working with people that are sort of asking the question, where should I be? And they're obviously undergoing a lot of stress. So how do you see stress playing out with the women that you work with, whether it's people you've worked with in the past, or, through what you were doing before, or through what you're doing now?
So I think if I just cast back to when I was working in medicine, I mean, certainly the thing about stress, quite interestingly, is very rarely are people just coming and saying, "Hi, doctor, I'm really stressed." So quite often people don't even know that they are as stressed as they are, because they become so used to it. So, that's one of the first things from a doctor's point of view, is you're always looking to see, potentially is stress one of the factors that the person is coming to see me today. But what we need to know about stress is that stress, the stressors, so the causes of stress, can be physiological or psychological, but certainly the way it presents can be the same, physical, and then also along the more sort of mental and emotional side of things. So what I really did see specifically around my women is, from the physical point of view, headaches, migraines. So we know that women and men do present differently with stress. I mean, it's been looked at in the studies. And what we do know is that women will have more of the sleep issues. They'll often come in feeling extremely fatigued, not explained by a lack of sleep, but just a sort of chronic fatigue that they just feel like they can't shift. Lots of muscular aches and pains, back pain, neck pain, many gastrointestinal difficulties. So you will often find people with their IBS flaring up, or poor indigestion, heartburn, that sort of thing. Lots of skin ailments are flaring up, things like acne. So, and then the other thing to always be aware of is people who've had either underlying diseases in the past will often flare up when they are going through chronic stress. So that's from the more physical side of things. We then see psychologically, mentally, this feeling. A lot of people have a kind of a brain fog. They can't really focus. They can't concentrate. They feel like they're really busy doing a whole lot of things, but not getting much done. The mood can be quite low. And especially in women, we know that they can be a bit more prone to panic and anxiety, and in some cases, actually more psychological illnesses like OCD specifically. And the other thing I always used to look out for were, and I really saw this working in corporate, the kind of unhealthy coping mechanisms. So people are drinking a bit more often, you'll notice. Some people will quit their exercise, others will maybe go and over exercise, overeating, some people under eating. So it really is usually quite a mixture of all of these things that we see when someone comes in to see you. So those are the main ways that I would have seen people presenting.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out about the differences between men and women.
Yeah.
I'm not a practicing medical doctor, but just from the women that I work with in my digital course, a lot of them they say up front, well, I really don't think stress is an issue for me, right?
Yeah.
And then we start to do some testing, and we get back cortisol and melatonin numbers, and we start to see, ooh, actually cortisol is an issue for you. There is some sort of stress, whether it's environmental or emotional, right? It depends, or it could be a combination of the two. But I'm glad you mentioned that as it pertains to men and women, because I think, one thing that I talk about here on the podcast and that I teach is this idea of, especially as we enter perimenopause as women, we start to see those adrenal glands start to compensate, right? And they start to really work harder to produce the sex hormones, and our ovaries are sort of, I always like to say, they're closing up shop, right? They're starting to wave goodbye. And so during that sort of 10-year period, or up to 10-year period, we can see where the adrenals are already a little taxed. And so whether it is through environmental factors or emotional issues, maybe it's marital issues or just stress at home, even just, I have 2 young children. I would say we're a happy family, but it's still stressful, like maintaining their schedules, and oftentimes for women, putting other people ahead of yourselves, that can really lead to this sort of slow over time drain, right? Some doctors call it adrenal fatigue. Some say adrenal fatigue doesn't exist. I won't get into that conversation here, but I still think that the impact on our adrenal glands, when it comes to things that are happening in our life, is obviously huge. Throw in the fact that these women are oftentimes entering that stage of life, and it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, and actually, I should have put on my list. I should completely didn't actually include the fact that perimenopause is a big issue because your hormones are fluctuating, and as you said, you are also going through a difficult stage often in life. Children are reaching a certain age. Sometimes the marriage is taking more strain, and but what we do know is with the fluctuating hormones and the physical symptoms that people experience, that itself can be a stressor and adding towards your stress. So it can be a bit of a vicious circle, because we know that having chronic stress can also make your menopause more difficult to manage. And I think I actually mentioned in our last discussion that so many women I saw in the sort of ages of 45 to 50 were having the most awful times, because it was almost like chicken and egg, terrible symptoms, feeling awful about themselves. The worse they felt, the less likely they were to engage in healthy behaviors to help them through the perimenopause. But actually, chronic stress also can impact fertility, which I know, many people have struggled with this, trying to fall pregnant. The more anxious and stressed you get about it, it seems the less likely. Everyone tells you need to relax, and well, you can't relax because you're trying to fall pregnant. So we know that fertility issues are quite common. And then the third one is actually premenstrual symptoms. Certainly with chronic stress, you can really struggle with far worsening PMS. So those are really, really important to remember when it comes to women's specific chronic stress. And I did want to actually point out that women are 30% more likely than men to experience the symptoms of chronic stress. But as you say, very few women will actually ever say this is from chronic stress. And they actually can be very high functioning and not really recognize the underlying root cause. So quite important to talk about it.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that just made me think of. One, when you talk about this vicious cycle, it's so true. Again, the women that I work with oftentimes will say, they kind of laugh off. I think it's interesting how many women will laugh off their sort of struggle with sleep, right? Like, oh, I
Yeah.
haven't slept since before my kids were born, or oh, I can't fall back asleep, or today I woke up at 4 a.m. and I couldn't fall back asleep, so I'm gonna double up on the coffee today, right? And they make these jokes about surviving with things like caffeine and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, actually, it's like a chicken or the egg thing now, right?
Yeah.
Like, so now you're just fueling this vicious cycle, and you're not allowing your body to get back into any sort of rhythm, right? And so there's that. But then there's also this sort of emotional piece that you mentioned too of I think a lot of times we don't want to acknowledge that our body is in some form of stress. It becomes sort of a sarcastic thing, right? It becomes
Yeah.
this. I actually just interviewed Stacey Miller. That podcast will have already launched when yours launches, but I interviewed her on this topic of alcohol and how
Yeah.
alcohol is becoming a crutch for women in a lot of
Yeah.
cases. And we talked specifically, and I'll make sure to link it up in the show notes as well. But we talked specifically about how it becomes sort of this habit, right? This like nightly drink or whatever, and it's a coping mechanism, which you briefly alluded to. But then again, that puts you back into this vicious cycle where we know that has an impact on your hormones. We know
Yeah.
that has an impact on your sleep. And so now you're sort of preventing yourself again from falling back into that rhythm.
Yeah, and alcohol has a terrible impact on mood. So it really is a depressant, and even a few glasses can have an impact. So yeah, quite right to mention that.
I also find that when women can really start to understand, how their bodies are designed to feel, I always say I measure everything in energy. So if your energy is off, you're
Hmm.
fatigued or whatever, then it's time to look into it. And I find that when women become self-educated about whether it's their menstrual cycles or their vitamin levels or whatever, when they start to learn like this is what it should be, this as opposed to this is where I am on this spectrum, they start to become empowered, like, oh, this is somewhat in my control, right? And I know oftentimes the last thing to become addressed is the stress, right? Like women
Hmm.
are so, people in general, right? I mean, myself included, like I would much rather start with a supplement. Like, can you give me something that I can supplement? Or is there something I should eliminate from my food or something, please tell me I don't have to work on my stress. Like that sounds really stressful in itself, right? So I do want to make sure that I ask you, what are some day-to-day things that we can do for managing our stress? What are your favorite things to recommend?
So some of it's in the work that I do is around establishing what perhaps some of the psychological causes and causes for the stress, but practically on on a sort of day-to-day things we can do. One of the first things I do like to talk to people about is mindset, because if you know now that you're stressed, can you almost feel more stressed because everyone's telling you stress is bad, stress is damaging you. So what we do know is what you choose to believe about your stress has a direct impact on how it plays out on your physiology. And this has been proven many times. I think Stanford, there's a professor there, Alia Crum, Crum, and she's spoken a lot about the various studies that they've done that have shown that what you choose to believe about something has a direct impact on your physiology. And there's a famous study called the milkshake study. You've probably heard of it. Same group of people are given two milkshakes. They're told that one is extremely calorific and they're told that the other one is very low in calories. And they test the blood samples after each milkshake. And they are, when they're consuming the high calorie milkshake and they think that this is full of fats and sugars, they actually see in the bloods high levels of the hormone ghrelin, telling the person that they are full and they've had a lot to eat. And then they do the same test on the very low calorie milkshake, and the ghrelin levels don't really rise, and the people still feel hungry, yet it's exactly the same sort of 200 calorie milkshake. So, and there's many other studies. So what I do like to talk to people about is actually just trying to become aware of your stress and what you're actually thinking about it, because stress usually comes from when you have stress in your life, it's usually something that you care about, right? Your relationships, your job, your financial situation, whatever it could be. So in some ways, stress is actually good because it's something that you care about. So if you can just flip it a little bit and think, okay, so I am feeling stressed. I'm going to actually embrace it. I'm going to use this feeling of stress and shift it a little bit more into the energy of perhaps even an excitement that, sure, this is a challenge, but it's a challenge for good because this is something that I really care about, rather than feeling really fearful about it. I also talk to people a little bit about how to manage acute stressful situations. So when people are feeling quite panicky, because as I said, with women, panic, anxiety can be quite severe. And I'm sure if you've experienced, if somebody tells you to calm down when you're feeling stressed, it actually doesn't work at all. So you just can't really control the mind with the mind. So there are times when people are really acutely distressed and maybe verging on panic, that will talk to them about breathing techniques. And there's a lot of literature on this. But one of the main ones you can do that you see, because the brain, your lungs, and your neural system and your cardiovascular system are all linked. So if you breathe in and then you really focus more on the exhalation, you are actually changing the beat of the heart and changing some of the nerves. And through that, you can actually slow your heart rate down. So what will happen is if you're feeling really over alert, overly anxious and panicky, you can bring down those symptoms from the very high adrenaline, and you can still have energy, but to feel calm. So those are some kind of practical things to do in the moment. But one of the main things that I speak to people about are simple tips around, first of all, when people have come to see me, I say, look, the fact that you are even mentioning this or asking for help or thinking that you might do something differently shows that you already have a bit of hope. And apparently the science says if you are actually asking for somebody to help you with your stress, or you are thinking about putting a stress management regime in place, you have already actually begun to manage your stress. So asking for help, I think, is a big thing. But one of the key things that I saw in my corporate job and even now is this concept of micro stresses. So often in life, something has gone wrong. Say one of your children's unwell. They're not that unwell, but it's just causing a bit of added stress. Something goes wrong with your pet, then there's, the light bulb needs replacing. All these little small things that are micro stresses adding up. And over time, I'm sure you've seen this, that people can be functioning reasonably, seem quite well, maybe a little bit stressed, but something small happens and they snap. So what I'm getting at is if you are aware that all of these small little things are adding up and compounding, if you are able to sort of dial back and reset every day, so kind of drop all the accumulation of those micro stresses, drop them down, to zero, or try and just actually reduce them a little bit, then each day you're starting afresh rather than carrying all the stress from the days before. So what I do encourage people to do is to have some sort of a morning routine. And I know this is spoken about a lot and maybe feels a little bit overspoken about, but I think that it is important to find even a few minutes at the start of your day just to reset yourself, set your intentions, kind of ground yourself a little bit before your day starts so that you aren't going in there with your stress levels already quite high. And what we do know is there isn't a one size fits all regime for anybody. It's what works for you. I've heard people saying they do 20 star jumps and 10 push-ups in their pajamas, and that's their exercise and it helps them. So what I do say is try and spend a few minutes in some sort of restful state, aware of your breathing. Maybe you're in prayer, maybe some meditation, maybe just focusing on your breath. Then we know that some sort of visualization work can be useful, just picturing maybe the goals that you're trying to achieve, the person that you're really trying to become, some sort of visualization, just trying to get your energy into the right place before you start the day. Some people like affirmations. A few minutes of natural daylight starts getting your cortisol and adrenaline going and getting you going for the day. And movement, which I know you're a big advocate of, some sort of movement. It doesn't need to be a lot, but even just a walk or some yoga just to get you going every morning. And I think if you can kind of set yourself to zero at the start of the day, you put yourself in a much better position as the day goes on. Then there are other things. Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, you're fine. This is so good. I mean, I just took so many notes and so many things. So we're going to pause here before we do any more questions. Because there's a few things that I want to mention and bring up and kind of dive deeper into. One, I think we start with sort of where you ended, which is this idea of these micro stressors. I remember when I first started seeing a functional medicine practitioner, I was asked this question for the first time. She asked me, what is your stress? Like, how would you rate your stress level? And we had a conversation about it. And then she said, okay, how is your perceived stress? In other words, like, what are the things like you just mentioned, like the light bulb, like what are those little things that you're perceiving as stress that perhaps need to be reframed? And I've noticed personally, and I just wanted to share this on the show, that now that I am very much in alignment with my menstrual cycle, I now see what what the different energies are for me throughout the cycle. I know when I tend to be more tired and less, more so not motivated. I also know what times of my cycle I tend to be high energy and I'm ready to push and focus and dial things in. And so one thing that I've noticed for myself is sort of in the first half of my menstrual cycle each month, I really have a go-getter attitude, but I can let perfectionism sort of creep in. And I think perfectionism is something that a lot of women, I know I coach women, I have health coaches on my team that I lead. This tends to come up over and over and over, where we feel like if we can't do something to the nth degree, we can't do it 100%, then it becomes this perceived stress, right? And that happens for me. Like the first half of my cycle, I feel that estrogen's starting to surge. I start to feel like I want to push in my workouts. I want to do more work. I want to, I'm motivated to do that kind of stuff. And then I find that after ovulation in the second half of my cycle, when that progesterone is coming into play, which is your naturally calming hormone, I know for me, I'm like, I'll get to it another time. Like I start to see my whole body just shifts, like my energy shifts into this, like, oh, it's okay, we'll figure out dinner later. Like I'm not so high strung, right? And so I wanted to just sort of pause and kind of talk briefly about this idea of perceived stress versus actual stress. And then also, how can we reframe that for ourselves so that we're not constantly putting these micro stressors in front of ourselves?
So, perceived stress versus actual stress. Well, I think that it probably is really the same thing in a way, because your body doesn't really know what is actual or perceived. So, as I mentioned at the start, our bodies respond either physically or psychologically to stress, and stress is basically something that's mobilizing us, making us trying to take action or pay attention to something. And it doesn't really know whether the stress is something you're just thinking about or whether it's something that's physical. It's actually the same sort of response. It doesn't know the difference. We are hardwired a certain way just to take on a stress, and then we have the response. So my view is, I don't think it really matters, because it's your perception of it that really counts. So back to the work that they did around mindset and stress, I think just trying to acknowledge that, yes, I am feeling stressed about this, but I think then what you can do is start challenging the way you're thinking about it. So one of the things that you can do, which I know I did mention on the podcast last time, is how to sort of challenge your automatic negative thoughts. And you can really do a simple test and ask yourself, is this actually true? This thing that I'm worrying about. Is it absolutely true? As in, is there evidence if I went to court that this is true? And usually the case is no. Okay, so how is this thing making me feel? Well, it's making me feel inadequate, fearful, doubtful, like a failure. Okay, so what is that doing for me? Well, it's not getting me anywhere. Okay, let's try and flip it around. Think about this thought a little bit differently. How does it make me feel? So a simple trick like that can really help you with your thinking around your stress. So yeah, that is how I would approach the sort of perceived versus real.
That's exactly where I was hoping you would go with that, because I know for me, like I was taught this through an analogy by an apothecary pharmacist who's a good friend of mine. He was sort of quizzing me when he was teaching me some things about hormones 10 years ago. He talked to me about, like, he gave me this example of, if I tell you to put your hand on the table and I have a sledgehammer and and I slap your hand with the sledgehammer, what's going to happen? He wanted me to tell him what's going to happen with my cortisol, what's going to happen with my blood sugar, what's going to happen. And so we start talking about it. And then the purpose of me sharing this is because then he said, okay, let's change the game. What if I told you to put your hand on the table, but I just threaten the sledgehammer, right? I'm threatening the sledgehammer, but I'm not actually slamming your hand. And I was like, my guess at that moment in my life was that something different would happen. And he was like, no, the same thing
Same
happens.
thing.
Your cortisol spikes, your blood sugar comes into play. Like everything starts to happen because it's perceived stress as opposed to the actual stress of the pain. Your brain is protecting you in the same way. We've talked about that before, this idea of your brain's goal and the purpose of you is to literally just survive, right? That's goal number one. And so if there's any sort of threat to that survival or that thriving, regardless of whether it happens or not, if you're perceiving it, it has the same impact
Exactly.
on your actual, chemistry. So
Yeah.
I'm so glad you went there with that. But I also want to just pause too about this idea of breathing techniques. This is not something new to my listeners. I actually have interviewed a few people on this subject.
Okay.
And but I want to make sure that we touch on that because I want to share a personal story. When I was struggling with, especially into my 30s, I started to have another downward shift in my progesterone. So my personal story is that progesterone deficiency has sort of been a big concern for me. It's something that I've had to really work on, both nutritionally, supplementally. It caused my migraine headaches. It was a big player in my migraine headaches in my 20s. But then in my 30s, I started to see it come into play again. Like the migraines came back and things started to change. Of course, it makes sense from a hormonal perspective. But when I was going through that and I was progesterone deficient and I was kind of navigating my way through these constant headaches and everything else, I remember I actually had, it's the only time in my life that I've ever had panic attacks. And I would find myself like, especially for some reason, it was always like in a car. Like if I had to drive somewhere, I would just tense up and just get super panicky. Never before in my life, and even since then, have I ever had this issue. And I remember calling my mom, like, cause in those moments, you're like, I just need someone to like, I don't know, like I'm frozen. And I don't know if you've ever seen the show This Is Us, which is an American drama. But there's a character on there who has panic attacks, and it's the perfect depiction of how I felt when I had them, which is this you're frozen, but your brain is going a million miles an hour. So I remember I picked up the phone and I called my mom because I didn't know what else to do. And I was like, I don't know, I'm panicking. I don't know. I'm just in a panic attack. And it was interesting because her response to me was, well, just calm down. And so for like the first 3 minutes of this conversation, she's telling me to calm down. And it was like almost like someone telling me I'm going to slap your hand with the sledgehammer, right? I was like, no, like this is not helping me. So we hang up the phone and I call my brother. And I'm like, I don't know who else to call. My husband was at work at the time. So I called my brother, and he has a master's degree in psychology and is working. He's very in tune with this whole, idea of like working with people through therapies and different things that he's studied. So immediately he says, okay, listen to my voice. And I want you to follow my voice. He says, I want you to inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. I want you to hold it for 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I want you to exhale for 1, 2. And I listened to him, and all I focused on was doing the thing. Like I focused on, instead of all the thoughts that were like racing through my mind, I thought, okay, I'm going to inhale. And I matched my breath to his voice. We just did basic box breathing. I had done it before. I had done it in yoga. I had done it in, different meditations that I had done. But in that moment, it wasn't the first solution that came to my mind. Ever since that day, ever since he did that with me, and I was able to down regulate my nervous system, I was able to really get back to a state of like equilibrium for myself. I wasn't freaking out anymore. It has become such a tool in my toolbox. When I get on an airplane, which is an uncomfortable place for me to be, right? When I get into situations where I feel panicked, I know that I can actually control my breath, which is going to control my body. And so I have some control over letting go in those moments. So I'd love to hear from you, whether you want to talk specifically about what breathing techniques might be good for someone, or if you want to dive deeper into that. I'd love to hear your perspective on breathing.
Yeah, so a good person to follow on this is actually Andrew Huberman. Huberman Lab podcast is excellent, but he talks a lot about what he calls the physiological sigh, S-I-G-H. So what he is saying is that when you breathe in and breathe out, our lungs inflate and deflate because of the movement of our diaphragm, which sits between our lungs and our abdominal cavity. And with the different movements of the diaphragm, it either compresses or creates more space for the heart. And this can actually impact the rate of the heart. And when the heart rate changes, there's a node in the heart, the sinoatrial node, which is linked to your sympathetic nervous system, which are the sort of chain of nerves running between your neck and in your sort of chest and up down to abdominal cavity, that is responsible for that surge of adrenaline and that sort of fright and flight response. So what he explains so well on his podcast and in the work that he does is that if you take 2 sharp inhalations, the second one is just to really fill up your lungs as much as you can. So just 2 quick, sharp inhalations, but you really focus on the exhalation. It's the long, forceful exhalation that creates the right sort of compression on the heart to slow your heart rate down. So what I love about this is, like you have discovered, you have learned a tool that if you were in the time of pressure, stress, panic, you felt your heart rate picking up, your breathing getting shorter, all of those sort of sensations, instead of becoming increasingly panicked, you now know you have a tool that you've used before. So this is a tool that he recommends, and I actually do this myself because it works really quickly. You can do it once, wait 30 seconds, and sometimes you need to do it 2 or 3 times, but you can really feel your heart rate slowing. And it just gives you that a little bit more space to have a bit of mental clarity. Sure, you're feeling quite alert and not quite agitated, but definitely, more quite alert, but more calm. And so that's the breathing technique that I like to give people if they're really feeling increasingly panicked. But I think I just love breathing for the meditation side of things. So whether it's box breathing or just counting your breaths, just bringing your awareness back to your breath. It's something you've got with you wherever you're going. You don't need to do anything but just to stop and focus on your breathing in whatever way works for you. And I think it really does. It's amazing as humans that we have this thing that we can just tap into whenever we need to, just to kind of bring us down a little bit. So that's what I'd recommend.
Yeah, so good. So good. My 5-year-old was recently ill and had to have an IV at the local urgent care.
Gosh.
And when we were in that situation, of course, the drama level's high anyway with a 5-year-old, and she wasn't feeling well. But I remember thinking, of course, she was panicking basically. And I remember saying, it's okay. You could just calm down, like take a breath. And then I realized, wait, don't tell her to calm down. Like that's the same thing that fires her up, right? And so immediately we went into breathing, and when it was all over, she came out of it. It ended up being way less drama than I ever anticipated. And I remember the person that was doing the nurse that was doing the IV, she turned around and looked at me and she was like, that's a really good idea. Like to have her focus on her breathing. She's like, I'm going to use that with people in the future. And I thought, yeah, like this is the type of stuff we should be taught, because it can actually really, truly help even from a very young age. I also think about the fact that my almost 2-year-old, when she gets really worked up, I always tell my husband, I was just holding her the other night. She got really worked up in the middle of the night. I don't know if it was a nightmare or what the situation was. And I always wait to like lay her back down or to get her tucked back in until she takes that big sigh, right? Like I want to make sure that she has completely down regulated, and then we'll lay you down. Right. And so it's funny because sometimes my husband will say like, are you still upstairs? Like just put her down. And I'm like, no, I haven't gotten the sigh yet. Like I need that big, like I'm okay now. Right. I'm comfortable and I'm safe. And then I lay her down. So I want to segue a little bit into, I think we've touched on some really good stuff, especially from a physical perspective on how women can really manage their stress and navigate their stresses. But I also want to talk about, obviously what you do now, which is helping people realize their full potential and really finding out what they should be doing in their professional lives and what their purpose is. What do you think is maybe the number one thing or the top couple of things that are holding people back from achieving that?
Yeah, so I think one of the causes of stress that I see a lot of, especially in our women, I mean, there's quite a few things, and you've mentioned them. Quite often people feel like they are failing. They have got so many people that they're trying to keep happy, and women tend to be more the people pleasers. And this is often compounded because I find that there's a lot of comparison. People comparing themselves and their lives to those around them. And it's probably made a little bit worse by social media. So people start thinking, well, I'm not as far along in my life as I should be. So comparison becomes a big problem and adds to stress. And what I see a lot of is people using the word stuck. And I feel that people are stuck because they are frustrated, probably because they've been saying yes to everybody else's needs and not to their own. But they are frustrated that they can feel that they are no longer growing. And they start to have this realization, certainly maybe mid to late 30s, maybe early 40s, like, hang on a second, I don't feel like I've really fulfilled the true potential of who I am. And this feeling of stuckness causes great stress in the people that I see. So one of the things I try and work with them and talk to them about is the concept of what is, and this is what's holding them back, some deep-seated self-limiting belief that they may have that actually they're not even aware of, but it ends up sabotaging them or creating the level of fear or worry or anxiety or even perfectionism, as you were talking about, that stops them from taking the risk to really step into the full version of who they are. And what I see, especially in the women that I work with, is that deep down, many women feel that they are fundamentally just not good enough, flawed, and they develop this fear that if they were to really step up into the full potential of who they were, to sort of be in their genius zone, to really go for it in the maximum version of themselves, if they did that, and deep down, if they actually believe that I don't think I'm really good enough, or there's something not quite right with me, I'm not going to be the one that makes it, then they run this huge risk of being completely 100% themselves and failing. That's a big failure, because that's basically saying, I gave it everything and I failed. But what I find a lot of women do is they kind of reach this upper limit and they don't really want to push beyond that, because the risk of failure is just, it's too overwhelming. So I find that a lot of women kind of shrink back. They play small, because if you take small risks, then you fail small. And it's quite easy to get caught in this, because one of the main problems that I see my women struggling with is not knowing how to say no and saying yes to everybody else's needs. So many women, you ask them how they are, they'll tell you about their kids, they'll tell you about their spouse, they'll tell you about what's ever going on in their home, their work or business, if they're doing that. And if those things are all fine, then they say they're fine. So people, so it's again a double-edged sword, because people don't have boundaries and they're not able to say no. They're not able to then create time to work on themselves, to really figure out what they want. But then they look around them and they think, hang on a second, why is everybody else moving on and I'm stuck and I'm not progressing? So it's about trying to help people work with those self-limiting beliefs and challenge them, and to actually try and notice when you might be sabotaging yourself or holding yourself back, and actually and to try and work with that, and to try and work with the sort of fear and self-doubt, and to move out of the familiar into the zone of, yes, it's higher risk, but actually really unsticking yourself and moving forward into figuring out where you are really at your best.
Yeah, this idea of self-limiting beliefs is so
Mm.
powerful. I'm sort of a self-proclaimed personal development junkie, so I've heard this phrase, self-limiting beliefs, quite often. And it's interesting because, you can listen to things like that over and over and over and understand the concept, but still not understand what your own are. And it's been a journey for myself, even, when I think about it. And I just wanted to say that, like, for me, determining what those self-limiting beliefs are
Mm-hmm.
comes down to, what am I saying most often to the people that I
Mm-hmm.
confide in? Because sometimes it's hard to know, what am I saying to myself, right? Like, you
Yeah.
can't, when you ask yourself the question, like, okay, what is my inner voice saying? Okay, well, you're gonna come up with all of the different excuses and reasons why, you want to keep down the path of self-limiting belief. However, when I start to think, like, okay, my husband tends to be my confidant. He tends to be the person that I say, well, this is what I'm aiming for, and this is what I'm doing, and he's the person that usually hears my excuses.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can think to myself, like, what am I telling him that could potentially be holding me back,
Mm-hmm.
or telling him it's okay to be a mirror to me, and to sort of shine this back to me and say, hey, now wait a minute, like, what you're speaking in the languages of self-limiting beliefs, right? Like, sometimes you have to have that person
Yeah.
that can really sort of hold up that mirror and say, now, wait a minute, this is keeping you, or it's holding you back, right? I can think of a time in my life where quite physically, I kept showing up in this room, like this actual event that was frequent for me. I kept appearing, and it was a highly stressful thing. Like there was toxic energy, there was a lot of things that would sort of prevent me from having the confidence I needed to step forward into what I needed to do. And I just kept showing up in that room, right? And I think after the third time that I kept mentioning it to my husband, he was like, "Why do you keep entering the room?" He was like, why do you keep going there? Like, why? And it was just like, it's what I needed to hear, right? And sometimes it's like, you can't be your own best life coach all the time, right? Like I
No,
mean,
definitely not.
you can do all the personal growth work on yourself, and you can listen to the podcasts, and you can read the books, and you can do these things to understand yourself and your personality and how you interact with other people. You can be a highly emotionally intelligent person and still most likely be dealing with self-limiting beliefs. You can have this sort of thing that's holding you back, whether it is, I'm not enough. I wrote down some things that you wrote. I'm flawed, right? I also thought of this. I shared this on a recent podcast about confidence. A lot of girls, I see this with my own girls, are almost told to play small, right? Like,
Definitely.
be quiet, you're being loud, or step down from that, or why are you taking risks? Whereas
Yeah.
boys are never questioned those things, right? And
Yeah.
so I think a lot of times, like you said, as women, whether it's societal pressure or social media or being told to play small or whatever the case is, I think as far as I'm seeing it now in the eyes of my girls, like how they're growing up, it is a societal pressure, but it's also one of those things where you have to surround yourself with people who are either a level up, or they think differently than you. They have positive energy, and they're able to sort of reflect back to you
Yeah.
what could be holding you back. And it really does expose your inner voice. You know what I
Exactly.
mean? Yeah. Yeah. So
And
good.
actually,
So, and
another one that's interesting for people to do, you can do it easily online, is enneagram testing. Can
yeah.
also reveal what your limiting beliefs are. And then also, if you really sit down and visualize who your ideal future self would be, and then think about, well, why am I not doing that? And as you say, even if you are just talking to your friend or your spouse, but saying it out loud, and if you have somebody who can challenge you back, which is what I'm doing in my coaching work, to actually say, do you hear how you're talking about yourself? People say all the time things like, well, I don't think I could do that, or I
Mhm.
wouldn't succeed at that, or I'm not the sort of person who would make that work. Even though it's just such a little flippant comment, this is what's going on in your brain all the time. So bringing the awareness to it, I certainly think having somebody to talk through makes a huge difference.
Yes, yes. I've worked with a life coach for a dozen years now, and she leads mastermind groups for my team. And it's so powerful to have women who come into this sort of like book club experience. And the one thing that I hear her say the most is, she'll ask a question, and someone, this happens all the time, where a woman will respond and say, I'm really going to try to blank.
Hmm.
Right. And so when we're asked for our action item each week, right, that, well, I'm going to try to focus on this. And her response is always, you're going to try? Are you
Or are
going to
you going to do
try?
it?
Or
Yeah.
are you going to do it? Right. And everybody needs that voice in their
Hmm.
life. Like they need, whether it's through you or a life coach or someone that can say, like, look, your language, like, this is your language. Do you realize that you're saying, I'll try? Or do you realize you're saying, I can't because, or I wish I could, right? Like those types of things in your language oftentimes are pointing to your self-limiting beliefs. Yeah, so
Exactly.
good.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up today, I want to touch on something that might be an interesting question, but I want to ask the question, is all stress bad?
So I think as we mentioned earlier, I mean, stress is really just a response, your brain and body being mobilized to an external force, whether it's physiological or psychological. And actually, the stress, when it's just in its acute form, is really beneficial and positive. It activates our immune system, for example, to fight off illness, bacteria, and infections. And you'll actually see, if you've heard of Wim Hof, who does his breathing is designed to increase your adrenaline to actually give you an acute stress response so that it can do things like fight off infection. That's actually what that's doing. So yes, acute stress, we really need it to help protect us in our immune system, but it also makes us focused. So our pupils dilate, our focus becomes more narrowed. We are able to evaluate the environment around us. We can be primed, ready for action, bringing our brain sort of online and sharpens our cognition. The tricky, and then also one more thing is that sort of immediate acute stress, and then maybe acute stress over a few days, maybe a few weeks, can be helpful to optimize our performance, to get jobs done, tasks done, to meet certain milestones. But the trick is really to be able to switch it off. And I think that's where we are going wrong. We are staying in this cycle of stress and eventually becoming chronic. So early stage, yes, of course, it's beneficial for us for our survival, but we have to be aware of when we're able to start switching it off.
I have a brief visitor.
I see that. I wanted to wave. So sweet.
She'll be edited out. But anyway,
So sweet.
Okay. Yeah. So I want to make sure that I ask you this question because you mentioned that you thought it was so important for women, especially to have a morning routine. And I also know that we talked a little bit about mindset and just having this sort of, you know, this way of thinking that's just more positive and maybe a gratitude outlook. This is something that I believe in as well. I keep a gratitude journal myself, but I have two questions sort of bundled together, which is, what does your morning routine look like? And also, what are you grateful for right now?
Great question to end. So my morning routine, I get up just before 5 and no questions asked. I get dressed and I go and do some exercise, usually in the gym. And I try not to look at my phone in the first sort of half an hour of waking, but that's something I'm still working on. And because I'm up so early doing my exercise, it's after that when I come home that I always, just before or after breakfast time, I will find 5-10 minutes just to sit quietly. And in that time, I will meditate, reflect, perhaps pray, and I will focus on my breathing. And I used to be quite prescriptive about the type of meditation I did. Now I just know it's really for me about focusing on my breathing. And the final thing that I do is I really think about my energy. Where's my energy at? And so I have done a lot of visualization work in the past where I just picture my ideal dream, no limits life, what I'm doing, where I am, how it feels. And I can quite quickly get into that most amazing feeling. And sometimes it's the best part of my day, but it gets me into a feeling of joy and excitement and not starting the day sort of on a negative footing. So I have a very clear vision of this future me. And I'm always asking myself, what does future me do in this situation? And I try and take that into my day. And my partner and I, every night we say 3 things that we are grateful for. And right now, I am grateful. Let's think about this one specifically. I am grateful that I have a wonderful relationship, a boyfriend, a spouse, a partner. After so many years of troubled relationships and thinking I was broken and was never going to be able to meet anybody and have a healthy relationship, I'm just really, really grateful to have such a wonderful person who's a friend and a support and someone who's growing with me in my life. So thanks for having me. And of course, grateful to be here.
That's amazing. You're such a light, and I love having you on the podcast because everything is so relaxed and comfortable and authentic and transparent. And I love what you're doing in the world. Again, I said this at the beginning. I love following you on social media. I want people to find you. I want people to find your resources. So if you would just share your website, all that kind of stuff, and we'll make sure to link it up as well.
Yeah, so I'm still mostly active on Instagram, and as you've seen, I'm upping my Reels game. So take a look, and I'm on Dr._Alice Penn, Penn, one word. And my website is dralicepenn.com. I've got some free resources there, and quite soon I'm launching my YouTube channel, so you'll see all the links in my site in the next few weeks. Thanks very much for having me, Jenny.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time as always.
It's really great.
Have a good one.
Thank you. Thank you. You too. Bye.